All right, happy Thursday, Reconcile. Pastor Kevin here, reporting from Asher, my youngest son's bedroom, because it's the only quiet place in the house. Okay, today we're in Matthew chapter 13 through 16, and let's get into that without further delay. So, we start out with this idea of Jesus teaching parables. What parables are is they're a mixture, they're sort of like a metaphor or a fable. Sometimes they're a story, sometimes they're a real quick illustration, but they're always meant to convey a deeper spiritual reality than what you see on the surface. And we start off with the first parable that Jesus talks about, which is probably one of the most known ones. It's actually the first thing I ever preached on, which was the parable of the sower. And the idea there is that it looks at the idea of how people respond to the good news, the message of the gospel. And we find that some people just flat out don't receive it. Some people receive it, but there's not really any kind of lasting change. There's fears that come into play and things like that, and that keeps people from having like a growing relationship with Jesus. And then ultimately we get to the good soil, and the good soil involves people who basically receive the message, and as a result, we're told they produce fruit. Now, this teaches an important reality here, which is that when we actually receive the gospel, true faith actually produces something. It has results to show from it. And so that's the first of the parables Jesus unpacks there. There's a bunch of others, and they all look at this idea of the kingdom of God. So there's the parable of the weeds, which looks at the fact that we have intermingled in this life right now the true followers of Jesus and false followers of Jesus. And ultimately, there's going to be this time in which God separates it, when God saves us from the very presence of sin. And so this is another reoccurring theme that Matthew gets at, is this idea of a coming time when God will judge the earth, when he'll separate his children from those who are not his children, and basically we have them being described here in verse 30 of chapter 13. There's a farmer who finds that his crop has both weeds and wheat in it, and he says, "Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." And so that's the idea there. Often God's judgment is seen as fire in the Bible. And so the idea is that God will judge the wicked, those who reject him, and he will gather and protect those who are his children. And then we also have more parables. We have this idea of the mustard seed and the leaven, which teaches this same concept. Two parables teach the same concept, which is essentially that the kingdom of God is growing. The kingdom of God is spreading. And so you got to think back, you go back to the first century, these disciples, there's only a few of them, and they're supposed to represent this new thing God's doing in the world, the whole world being changed. And outwardly, it wouldn't look like that. However, now we're 2,000 years separated from it, and we can see that the gospel is spread throughout the world. You'd be hard-pressed to find a place on earth right now where there aren't some followers of Jesus. And so we see the fulfillment of that already, and then we also have the confidence knowing that this is going to continue. Basically, it's something that starts out small but continues to advance. In other words, nothing will hold back the growth and expanse of God's kingdom on this earth. And so then we get to this idea of what's the value of being part of God's kingdom. And we have this idea of hidden treasure coming up in another parable. And the idea there is really simple. Being a part of God's kingdom is invaluable. There's nothing more precious that you could gain than a place in God's kingdom. This should be something we are constantly reminding ourselves of, guys. The fact that there's really nothing more worth living than a life following Jesus. There's nothing more valuable than actually having a place in God's kingdom. And so we're encouraged that even if we've lost things for the sake of following Jesus, ultimately what we receive is more valuable. It's more precious. And then we see Jesus anticipating the question of when. Like, when is all this stuff going to happen? And so he addresses this in this parable of a net. And in one sense, we might say, that God's kingdom is already arrived. So Jesus said the kingdom of God is at hand. So there's one sense that the king has come and been revealed. And one of our core convictions that we talk about as a church is this idea that the church is a picture of life in God's kingdom, which is true. Anywhere there's followers of Jesus, you see some glimpse at what God's kingdom is meant to be, the way life's supposed to be lived. However, there will also be a time when ultimately God is going to save those who have faith in Jesus from the very presence of sin, and sin itself will be removed from the world. And there we have this idea of the kingdom in its fullest, which Jesus here refers to as the end of the age. So then we shift from Jesus' talk on parables to Jesus performing miracles. And this is really like he's really playing the hits here, Matthew, as these are some of our most known miracles of Jesus. We see Jesus twice feeding crowds. We see him walking on water and all these things. One of the things that all these miracles have in common that we see in Matthew's gospel here is that Jesus tends to relate them back to the issue of faith. We've already talked about this idea. God's kingdom is received by faith, by trusting in him. And God values faith. And so we find this over and over again here. We read that Jesus goes to Nazareth, and he doesn't perform a bunch of miracles. It says, chapter 13, verse 58, that Jesus did not do many mighty works. Why? Because of their unbelief, that is, their lack of faith. And then we find Jesus calling Peter out to him on the water to walk. And as Peter begins to sink, Jesus tells him this statement, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" That's in chapter 14, verse 31. So we see here, once again, this idea. He's not doing a lot of healing in Nazareth. Why? Because the people reject him. They don't have faith in him. They don't trust him. Jesus sort of trusts him. He sort of believes him, so he walks out to him on the water, but then he sees the water and becomes afraid, and he begins to sink. Why? Because his faith is little, as Jesus says. He believes in one sense, and then sort of doesn't as well. And then finally we get to this story of a Canaanite woman who has a demon-possessed daughter that she wants Jesus to heal. Now, we've talked about Canaan and the Canaanites a little bit in our sermons on Genesis even, but the Canaanites were the last people you would expect Jesus to be kind to, Jesus to be holding them up for their faith. But this woman says, this woman comes to Jesus, and she knows that Jesus is the only one who can heal her daughter. And then he says this in verse 28, he says, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done to you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. What's this showing us, the readers? Well, it's showing that Jesus is looking for faith, not religious traditions, which you would expect to see a lot of in Nazareth, not nationality or birthright. It's not about where you were born that defines a person as a citizen in God's kingdom. It's whether or not they trust in Jesus, whether or not they believe, whether or not they have faith. And then last, in chapter 16, we get to this issue of proof. Okay? So, we have Jesus explain the nature of the kingdom. We see different responses to it in his miracles, that Jesus is that those who are closest to the kingdom are those who most believe, those who have faith. And then my kids are crying in the background. They're fine. Anyways, last in chapter 16, we get to the proof. And so the religious elite, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, asked Jesus for a sign. And by a sign, what they mean is give us some evidence, give us some proof that you're from God. Now, there's something you have to understand here. It's not that there was no proof. There was tons of proof. Matthew's already given tons of proof. All these things were visible. People were getting healed. People, the blind were seeing, the lame could walk. Jesus was feeding 5,000 people with like a few loaves and fish. So it wasn't that there was lack of evidence out there. And so this is what Jesus chastises them for. It's not that Jesus is against offering proof, but he's already shown plenty of it, and they still don't believe. And what they want to do is basically if Jesus doesn't jump through this hoop for them, they want to feel justified in keeping him at arm's length and rejecting him. So Jesus responds. He tells them in chapter 16, verses 3 and 4, he says, "You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the sign of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah." Okay, once again, it isn't that Jesus failed to show them proof. He's given them abundant proof, but they're unconvinced by the proof he's offering. Now, by going to this idea of the sign of Jonah, what we see here is that he's showing them that, look, even if he comes back from the dead, they're not going to be convinced of it. So it's not because of lack of proof that they don't believe. So what might be holding them back? Well, we see someone who finally gets it, who's seen these signs and actually receives this in chapter 16, and that's our guy Peter. Jesus basically, after doing all these things, literally, like, he's seen Jesus do miracles, he's done miracles by telling people, he's preached the gospel, he's done all these things. Jesus goes, "Peter, who do you say I am?" And Peter says to him in chapter 16, verse 16, Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Okay, so Peter finally gets it. He finally understands, Jesus, you are the Messiah that everybody's been waiting for. You're that guy. And then Jesus explains in verse 17, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Now, why does Peter get it? Is it because he's smarter than the Pharisees or anything like that? No, not at all. He's a regular blue-collar fisherman kind of guy. But why is it that Peter gets it? It's because God has revealed it to Peter. That's why. He understands the evidence because he's been given eyes to understand the evidence that's in front of him. And then once again, we see that Jesus is trying to keep things kind of on the down low. So after all this happens, what Jesus tells him is this. Verse 20, it says, "Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ." So still there's this idea of like, okay, even though this is true, just keep it on the down low. We're going to talk more about that on Sunday when we get to Palm Sunday, but just want to point that out. Okay, so Peter's, he said the right things. You'd assume that at this point in time he's feeling pretty awesome. I figured it out, like I realized this is the Messiah. This is the people. This is the guy everyone's waiting for. And it doesn't last long, however, because after declaring that Jesus is the Christ, what Jesus then does is he turns to the subject of the cross and the resurrection. And Peter, in essence, says, "No way, Jesus, not on my watch." And then we get the sharpest rebuke that Jesus probably gives to any of his disciples in all the gospel accounts. He says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Basically, Peter, you are just thinking selfishly. You don't understand what God has planned. And then we end chapter 16 with these famous words of Jesus. He explains the cost of discipleship, the cost of following him. And in verse 24, he says, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." So here we understand that being a disciple of Jesus comes with a cost to it. It will not be an easy life. It's not an easy life we've all been called to. But in laying aside our own plans for life and trusting in Jesus and his plans, what we do is we find a life that's actually worth living. The person who loses his life, that is, his own idea and plans for what his life is supposed to be for Jesus' sake, finds it. And what we find far outweighs what we've left behind, what we've lost. And so that's the significance of being a part of Jesus' kingdom. That's why it's so valuable. That's why it's the treasure that's worth selling everything for. And so that brings us to the end of chapter 16. Guys, there's a whole lot more, like I said. This is by no means a sermon on 4 chapters of a rich and full gospel account, but I hope you're getting a ton out of this stuff beyond what I'm saying in these videos. And I look forward to diving into the story of Palm Sunday and Matthew 21 with you guys further on Sunday. I'll be back here tomorrow, and we'll finish out our Gospel Reading Challenge. Take care, guys.